Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Very happy to have you with us this evening for our PASI January meeting, Native American Voting Rights. And tonight we are very delighted to have with us Stephanie Woodard, an investigative reporter and author of American Apartheid, the Native American Struggle for Self-Determination and Inclusion. And for nearly 2 decades, Stephanie Woodard has been reporting on Indian country in various publications. So she has a wonderful program planned for us, and I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie. Stephanie, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. We're about to show you a video interview with Barb and O.J. Siemens, who are the co-directors of Four Directions Voting Rights Group on the Rosebud Sioux Reservation in South Dakota. For decades, Barb and O.J. have worked to increase Native enfranchisement with successful federal voting rights lawsuits and vigorous internet-enabled Get Out the Vote campaigns. The Get Out the Vote campaigns have been on reservations and during the 2020 election in Georgia. During the January Senate runoff, Four Directions staff and volunteers wearing PPE knocked on many thousands of doors in Atlanta. More Georgia tribal citizens knocked on doors in their particular homelands. This year, Four Directions is working with Stacey Abrams' Fair Fight and Jeannine Abrams McLean's Fair Count. The goal of the organizations is to register more of Georgia's 100,000 Indigenous people of voting age and help them access the 2022 ballot box. 100,000 is an interesting number because Stacey lost by about 50,000 votes in her recent bid to become Georgia's governor. So a whole lot of new voters could be very telling in the upcoming election. Though few of us in mainstream America realize it, the Native vote is a substantial percentage of the voting age population in numerous states, including about 10% of Montana and South Dakota, 11% of New Mexico, 12% of Oklahoma, 17% of Alaska, and more. And again, though few of us know this, that makes Native voters the decision makers in closely divided red-blue states and in closely contested races. They typically vote Democratic. However, they aren't party line voters as much as issue-oriented voters whose ideas happen to most often align with Democratic ones. Now, for more, let's hear from Barb and O.J. O.J. is on this Zoom call until 7:30 Eastern. So after this short video is over, you will have the opportunity to ask him some questions. Sally, can you roll the video interview with Barb and O.J.? Welcome, Barb and O.J. You and Indian country have been going from strength to strength these days. Deb Holland of Laguna Pueblo heads the Department of the Interior. Indigenous people have important posts at a lot of other agencies. In relation to the building of a pipeline, the UN has, for the very first time, questioned US fulfillment of treaty promises. There's been more mainstream media attention, and we have seen the bipartisan introduction in Congress of the Native American Voting Rights Act of 2021. So, do you feel less invisible now than you did as recently as the 2020 election when CNN referred to Native voters as a group as something else? Have things improved at all along those lines?
First of all, there's a good and bad in being recognized. The good is that people also know we're there. The bad is that because they know they're concentrating more on developing different types of voter suppression. They're very aware of the power of our vote, and therefore they're looking at finding different ways to lessen that power. One of them right now we're concentrating on is the current redistricting. Most of Indian country, regardless of the pandemic, was able to increase the count, the census count, actually the highest in census history. But just because your numbers increase doesn't mean you're going to get that empowerment, because they could use that number to actually dilute the vote. So, I mean, it's a never-ending battle. You always have to stay constant.
You have both done educational work about registration and voting all over Indian country. What results do you see?
But it used to be, we felt intimidated because of the way the workers treated us, the poll watchers. But now that we have information on it, know about it, we can speak up for ourselves.
Your family as a whole is involved in voting and voting rights. On Pine Ridge, during a federal election, I observed your daughter, Donna, managing a successful Get Out the Vote campaign encompassing many voters, many drivers, and a lot of territory. Even beyond that, your family extends itself for the betterment of others.
I was raised that way. My dad and mom always told me, you take care of other people. People used poor Indians that didn't have anything to eat would come to our house, and we had dirt floors, and they would feed them. Always be kind to people and treat people the way you want to be treated. When you grow up like that, you feel that way. It's just in you, and that is our culture, though.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Native American Voting Rights Act?
Four Directions was part of a group called the Native American Voting Rights Coalition. We held hearings throughout the United States and Indian country. I chaired one that was in North Dakota, and I also chaired one that was in Wisconsin. And we were able to bring in tribes from all over the country. We also had it on the East Coast, down south, and on the West Coast. And it was during that time that we took testimony from tribes and tribal members on the difficulties and the barriers that they were facing when trying to participate in the electoral process. What we found was generally the same all over, but just different ways they did it. Ballot collection, because of our tradition, we would work with friends and relatives if we were going somewhere and they didn't have a means to do it. We'd pick up their ballot and drop it off. Well, the Native American Voting Rights Act is basically addressing even prior to the Supreme Court ruling Burstovich versus DNC, in which the Supreme Court said that ballot harvesting, as they call it, could not be done in Arizona. Well, we addressed that, and we've been working on the Native American Voting Rights Act for about 4 years. And so that is actually part of the Native American Voting Rights Act, is being able to work with your family and friends and take ballots to the polling location in order for them to be counted. So that's one of them. The other one that the court ruled on was voting on a precinct. That is also being addressed in the Native American Voting Rights Act, where there's a cure for it. So we didn't know it, but we actually saw into the future of what was going to happen, and actually created some safeguards within the Native American Voting Rights Act to protect them.
The Native American Voting Rights Act has enforcement provisions, does it not?
It would be up to the party to file a complaint that it's not being adhered to, but that would basically be towards the Department of Justice to look into if there's a violation.
The bipartisan Native American Voting Rights Act, if passed, would mandate important actions, set up registration and voting on reservations so Native people don't have to drive scores or even hundreds of miles to do so, equal access to absentee and early voting, acceptance of tribal IDs, and much more. However, I have seen in reporting on federal elections that the counties that run them pull what I would call stunts on reservations, stationing a sheriff in the doorway of a polling place, canceling registration and voting times at the last minute. As OJ has said, the counties form a kind of thin line against Native enfranchisement, regardless of party. Will the Native American Voting Rights Act prevent these stunts, these last-minute brainstorms?
If you have individuals out there that are bound and determined to keep natives from voting, there's no law on earth that is going to stop that. The only way you're going to stop it is to continually to increase the native turnout at the polling places and replace those elected officials.
Your governor is facing calls for impeachment. She had ordered removing references to Native history from education in South Dakota. This was after a statewide education committee recommended adding more. In the past, she has attacked Native people often and seemingly with impunity. This time, though, she's being called to account. What happened?
I think the natives all went here and protested, and they got media attention.
It worked. What's changed?
South Dakota is actually getting younger, and that people don't have that same prejudice as you see in the baby boomers. You see a lot more interaction between all peoples of color, and you know, even the white people here in South Dakota, they look at it and say that's not right. But this one I think is coming back to really haunt her, and you know, the numbers are going up in South Dakota as far as voter registration. Given a good candidate, she got a possibility of losing.
Non-native outsiders often view tribes as insular groups caring only about themselves. And the words tribe and tribalism are often used with a pejorative meaning along these lines. I've even seen that somewhat recently. We were talking earlier about how there's been more mainstream coverage, and you said, you know, there's a good and a bad to that in every case. And I was really surprised to see an article in one of our nation's important newspapers that talked about a sense of tribe as being like basically a bad thing, that if someone has a sense of tribe, all they care about is themselves and the small group around them. But it seems that what we've been learning in these sessions over the last couple of weeks is that yes, there's a concern for the local, but there's a sense that the local is a contributor to the global, and everything is done in terms of global responsibility.
You can look at the history of Native Americans in organizations. We supported the immigration, not the laws that they did, but we supported people coming into this country. Although I will admit we messed up at first in the 1400s by not having tougher immigration. But to this day, we supported that. We opposed the jailing of small children of color because they wanted to come into the country. We opposed the separation of those families. We supported DACA. I mean, there are so many things that we stand behind that really don't affect us. And so it's not just that we're looking at, tribal interests. We look at interests of the country as a whole, because regardless of what most America thinks, this is still our country. And that when people come here, that we want them to be afforded the laws and the dignity of human beings. So I can see where they're coming from, but I don't see how they can say that tribes are basically looking out for themselves, because we have reached out on a lot of national issues in which we supported other people of color. Just to let you know, is Four Directions has actually has a memorandum of understanding with Fair Fight out of Georgia, and we're working with them in the state of Georgia, and we're working with the Native Americans there. And we have another memorandum of understanding with Fair Count. Now, Fair Fight is with Stacey Abrams. Fair Count is with Jeannine Abrams, McLean, her sister. But it's not just Indian issues over there. I mean, we are looking at the laws that have been passed. Natives have joined the lawsuit filed in Georgia on the restrictive of the legislation to reduce the turnout of people of color. And so we're constantly doing things that affect people nationally, not just people of color, but all people.
Speaking of you're doing positive things on behalf of the country, Native people as a population group contribute the highest percentage of their population to the armed forces, and you yourself are a veteran, OJ.
And it's part of our tradition. This goes back thousands and thousands of years, in which we always had a responsibility that each of different societies within the tribe had obligations, and one of them's being an Akichita, in which you serve in the armed services. So it's basically a tradition that's been handed down over and over from generation to generation. So that's what you see when you see Natives joining the military, is that tradition. But that tradition also is the fact that we have we've signed treaties, but the land's still ours. The treaty I look at as like a long-term lease for the United States,
which they never honored.
Thank you, Barb and OJ Siemens of Four Directions Voting Rights Group. Okay, thank you so much. Now it's time for some questions. OJ is here just until 7:30. So I'll get things rolling with a question of my own. OJ, you had mentioned working to prevent gerrymandering. What's going on with that in South Dakota?
Well, basically, we met with the state legislatures in South Dakota. We were able to get everything we wanted as far as redistricting. We were able to even change voters, in which we made one of the reservations, a Crow Creek reservation, a whole district instead of them being divided up. We were also able to create a majority minority district in Rapid City, which is our second largest city, where we have a high Native American population in one area. So instead of them being divided up into 3 or 4 different districts, we now have them all into one district. So we may not be able to elect a Native, but it's going to be a competitive race regardless of who is running for office. It's not just going to be handed off anymore.
Excellent. Eileen, I think you had a question about Georgia voters.
Yes, OJ, first of all, thank you for being here tonight. It's wonderful to have you. And I know that Four Directions is working to register 100,000 Indigenous people of voting age. How successful have they been?
Well, the holidays have just ended. So we are going to be starting here in January to actually start knocking on doors and doing the voter registration. But we're working hand in hand with Fair Count that's in Georgia too. So it's being put together as we speak, but we haven't actually started it yet, but we will start. And once we do, I'll let Stephanie know how we're turning out on that.
Mm-hmm. Well, good luck with that. That's got a lot of work ahead of you, but I'm sure you'll accomplish some wonderful things.
Well, we actually had a 71% turnout of those self-identified or that identified them as Native Americans. So in Georgia in during the special election, the runoff with Ossoff and with Warnock, we had a 71% turnout of Native American voters in Georgia, which
wonderful.
Was the highest of any of the races that cast a ballot.
Great, thank you.
Anybody else? You can unmute yourself and ask the question, or raise your hand, or do it however it works for you.
Well, how about while they're thinking about it, I want to give a shout out to Stephanie. She has been a friend to Indian country since way back when. And then the other one I want to really acknowledge, I consider part of the family and that has walked with us through all of this turmoil, is Greg Limbrick. He has been with us, when we weren't for directions, we worked directly for the campaign for Senator Tim Johnson. Was that 2000, Greg, or 2002?
That was 2002. So next year will be the 20th anniversary.
Yeah, and so I mean we have a lot of battle scars. Stephanie, Greg, and Barb and I of taking and breaking South Dakota to the halter. So I just wanted to make sure that you guys knew how important they were to us.
So Stephanie, can I ask OJ and Barb a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
So and this is something that I didn't have a chance to see firsthand, but a story that I think the group would really enjoy hearing about, because some of them may remember reading about it back in 2018, was up in North Dakota, right before the 2018 midterm elections, when thousands of Native Americans living on reservations were basically disenfranchised at the 11th hour by a new voter ID law that said that residential addresses needed to be on IDs, and that PO boxes were not valid as residential addresses. And I think OJ and Barb, maybe you can maybe you can explain sort of why that was such an issue, and also what 4 Directions and how you worked with the tribes to overcome that, because I think that's really an amazing story of the work that you guys have done, but also the work that still remains to be done, and how suppression still is out there, and can even days before an election or weeks before an election can still still legally prevent thousands of Native Americans from voting.
You're right. North Dakota is a perfect example. It's even when they had a primary, during the primary, their IDs were good and they had post office boxes. And prior to the general, they came out and they changed the law. And it was, at least in my lifetime, where the Supreme Court came out, or the 8th Circuit Court came out, and even the Supreme Court came out and jumped into a middle of an election where they usually just stay fast. So what they did prior to the general is they required every tribal member to have a ID that had their physical address on it. Well, there was no physical addresses on the reservations in North Dakota or South Dakota for that matter. And so what we did, 4 Directions went up there, we met with the tribes, and we read the law. And what we did is we created physical addresses for them, kind of like you see the apartment complexes where you have 279th Avenue, apartment A, 1, 2, 3. Well, we use the same concept and created boundaries within the districts and created physical addresses. And then we used the tribal letterhead, and the tribe had it set up, computer up. And so the tribal members were able to come in and then give their name and where the location they live. We would look at a map and then turn around and give them an address, a physical address, and then they would take that tribal letterhead to go vote. The first day that we tried to do it, we ended up having to fight with the sheriff, the auditor, the attorney general, even the governor, where they tried not to allow that. But after they did the review of what their law actually said, the letterhead with the person's signature as a declaration had to be accepted. And get this, they had a physical address, but the letterhead didn't have a picture on it. So, I mean, they lost on that one. But yeah, you always have to look at what they're trying to do. And then you have to think outside the box in order to make sure that thousands of people aren't turned away from the polls. And North Dakota during that time had the highest turnout in election history during that race. The candidate of their choice didn't win, but the voice was loud and clear of the Native Americans of North Dakota. They weren't going to sit still, and the numbers proved it.
And a lot of those voters, they got 2 for the price of 1. They got to learn their home address and they got to vote in the same election.
Yeah.
And the amazing thing to me, in the elections that I've worked on with Four Directions and the elections I've been fortunate enough to watch from afar, that OJ, Barb, and their daughter Donna and other folks from our team have worked on, and from Nevada to Georgia and many places in between, is to see that, where there has been voter suppression efforts, that, not only have the efforts to push back from Four Directions and our partners, been successful in getting voters to the polls, but oftentimes we've gotten voters to the polls in actually record numbers. We end up, people are so upset that someone tried to keep them from voting. We end up getting more people to vote than ever voted before.
And that happens everywhere we go, because people basically do not like to be told that they can't do something. And when they see a law created just to keep them away, it gets them more fired up in wanting them to participate. One quick story. Greg said going back 20 years, but we worked Rosewood, and Greg came down here when we were working for the campaign. Greg worked in St. Francis as one of the attorneys that was monitoring the polling place. Well, we were on Mountain Time, and they put us and opened up on Central Time. And Greg caught this, and he ran it up the chain, and it went all the way to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General said that Todd County would be allowed one more hour in which to vote, because they opened up on Central Time, not Mountain Time. Well, during that hour on the Rosebud Sioux Indian Reservation, we got over 600 more people to vote. And it was during that time that Tim Johnson went to bed losing by 3,500 and waking up in the morning winning by 524. So, I mean,
Wow.
Greg had a lot to do with that. And then he was the only one that when he made it to Sioux Falls, it was empty.
Wow. OJ, I have a question. What do you think is the impetus behind people coming together and working so hard to make sure that they can vote, to stop the suppression? Is it?
Well, I think
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
mainly it's issues. A lot of times you have to understand Indian country, when we go out to vote, I mean, I know that when people listen to the president or listen to the senators or house speakers, they talk about taxes, they talk about roads, they talk about housing. This is important to us too, but you have to understand we have treaties with the government. So when you talk about housing for the common people out there, the citizens, that's one thing. But when you talk about housing for tribes, that's a treaty obligation. And so there has to be a different type of messaging that goes out there to individuals or tribal members to say, this is why it's important.
Mhm.
I can tell you that the native vote was very important in Georgia. 2 Democratic senators got out there, and it was because of them that the Senate had a majority that was able to put Deb Haaland, the very first Native American woman, as a cabinet member to the secretary, as a Secretary of Interior. And so it wasn't just because of the local issues, but they also saw that they needed to take and get people in key positions throughout the federal government.
Hmm.
Hopefully I answered your question. Sometimes
Yes, you
I
did.
don't.
Thank you.
Let me just add something, and that is that we've talked a lot about the voters and making sure that people's vote is not suppressed and so on. But one thing that we've also seen happen over the last several elections is more Native candidates elected to office. Deb Haaland and Sharice Davids were the first 2 Native American women elected to Congress. But if you look at state legislatures across the country, there are a lot of Native people being elected from, and not just from reservation precincts, but from all kinds of precincts. And in a lot of cases, they then become their party leader. So they're the minority leader of the Senate of whatever, or the majority leader, depending on that party's stance. so like, for example, in South Dakota, there's a Native person who is the Senate minority leader and that sort of things, but that is just replicated across the country. So that was an interesting thing to see in recent years, is that Native Americans are voting more, but just plain Americans are voting for Native Americans. And so that has been, I think, a really interesting
An
and
eye opener.
positive, yeah,
Yeah.
and a very positive trend.
Yes.
I ran into a wonderful story. Ruth Anna Buffalo was running in Fargo, and she's from.
Just so you know, she's the one that the person she defeated is the one that did the ID law.
Yeah, yeah. Well, she said when she was running for office, she said that Republicans had won her seat for such a long period of time, they didn't even bother campaigning anymore. And she walked like 8 to 12 miles a day, house to house to house, always with another lady accompanying her. And she said she drank gallons of coffee because people were so astonished to see a candidate on their front porch saying, "What do you want?" that they invited her in and they told her. And so, and she won. And it was a really interesting story, you know, that a sincere, caring person who wants to do things that people need done. And she said everything they wanted everybody wanted the same things. They wanted better schools. They wanted new jobs. They'd heard about these green jobs. They wanted to know what was that all about? Could we get some of them? And they wanted fair taxes because, of course, they had just heard about the enormous, what was it, $1.5 trillion tax tax break for the ultra rich, and everyone wanted the same things. And she said, "Well, that's my platform. That's what I want to do." So anyway, they elected her, and it was just the most wonderful story of how a sincere person who cares about other people can win. Works.
Yeah.
Well, we're also taking over not on school boards, county commissions.
Yeah.
I mean, I tell people the county is the first line of defense in voter suppression, because it's not so much that they don't want us to vote for the president, the U.S. Senate. What they don't want us to do is have a seat or have control of the county seat or have control of the election office or school boards. And so that's where you find the actual suppression starting. And so we've had to fight that. But like I said, we are now having majority of natives on county commissioners, school boards. We're taking and replacing even Democrats in different places with natives because they wouldn't allow us the access to the polling places. So you're right. A lot of it's local too. With that, I really need to go. I have to jump on another one.
Okay. Thank you so much, OJ. We learned a lot.
Thank you.
One more
And sure.
Was that issue with the addresses only in the Dakotas, or was that in other reservations also?
Well, in this instant, it was just in North Dakota. I mean, they are trying it on other reservations. Years ago, they tried it in South Dakota, but we were able to get it so that a individual could file an affidavit, say this is where I live and this is who I am, and do it. But they are doing it. And one of the things, when South Dakota settled the lawsuit, one of the things that we made an issue is that if everybody looks on their bill, they have a telecommunication charge, surcharge, or whatever. Everybody has that, and that's is basically to help 911 addresses and create these physical addresses. Well, the state of North Dakota has been getting that money. The tribes, the tribal government, the tribal members have all been paying into that surcharge, and for the last 40, 50 years, and yet they were required to do those physical addresses for the money that they received, and they never did it. They knew they never did it, and then they created a law saying you have to have it. I mean, so North Dakota is one of the places where they got really down and dirty, but in the end, they had to back off. play fair because we actually had them to the rights in court.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank
As
you
we
so
say in
much.
Lakota, arrivederci. Oh,
Wow.
all right. Thank you, Stephanie. Greg, it's great looking at you and seeing you in person via
Good to see you.
video. All right, I do have to go, but thank you all very much, very much.
Thank
see you
you,
in October.
OJ. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
So now we are actually going to turn things over to Greg Lembrich, who's going to tell us about voter protection that he sets up on South Dakota reservations using teams of volunteer attorneys and law students for federal elections. And so, Greg, if you could tell us about that, that would be great. How you got involved with that, what it entails, how someone could volunteer to join you.
Absolutely. So thank you, Stephanie, and thank you to this this whole group, Staten Island Peace Action, for having us here tonight. I've been involved, as I was just mentioning. This is my 20-year anniversary. I was first involved when I went out to South Dakota in 2002 as I was a law student at Columbia Law School, and my best friend from law school, a guy named Ben McAdams, and I had both been involved in politics before law school and wanted to work a campaign together. And we decided to go out to South Dakota and work on the campaign for Senator Tim Johnson. And our assignment was to go out to reservations in Western South Dakota and help register voters and then make sure they could vote. And we were just blown away by what we saw out there. I mean, I'm from the Northeast. I'm from New Jersey. Went to college and law school in New York City, and I had never really spent time in rural America, and certainly I'd never even been to Foxwoods, much less a big Great Plains Indian reservation. So to get out to Rosebud, to Pine Ridge in South Dakota was really mind-blowing for me. And then just to piggyback on what OJ said, to see the voter suppression really on the local level, as a lot of voters, tribal members were voting for the first time, had previously only voted in tribal elections, but were voting for the first time in state and federal elections. There was suppression at the state level, but a lot of the suppression was really at the local level. And it wasn't that these folks really cared who was the senator or who was the president as much as they cared about the fact that a lot of these counties were majority Native American, some 80, 90% Native American. And they knew that once the tribal members started voting, that the tribal members were going to take over the county commissions and the school boards and win seats to the state legislature and take over the local utility commissions and these things that had basically helped largely the white ranchers keep control over the reservations, or at least the resources on and around the reservations up until that point for the entire 20th century. So, there was some very active, not just legal suppression, some very illegal suppression when I first went out to South Dakota, people blocking access to polling places, threatening people both inside and outside of polling places, physically, but also trying to intimidate them. I know your boss, if you go inside and vote, I'm going to say you're a troublemaker and I'm going to get you fired from your job. We even one time had a nun who was trying to intimidate people, local people from voting. Voter intimidation takes many forms. And that's when I knew that, I couldn't build better roads or better schools or help bring electricity to some of the rural areas that needed it. But, what I could do is use my political background and my legal expertise to help make sure that at least the folks in the tribes could elect, could exercise the right to vote and could elect the people who could bring about those positive changes for them. I got to know Barb and OJ and other great community leaders and tribal leaders out in South Dakota. And I became the legal director for Four Directions, and I've been doing that since 2008. And every election since then, with the exception of 2020 because of the pandemic, I have been out in South Dakota and been fortunate to lead a team that's usually at least 40, sometimes as many as 50 or 60 volunteer lawyers and law students from around the country who come out to South Dakota and help us out on the reservations to, they're in polling places on election day, watching the polls, working with the poll workers, working with the voters to make sure that voting rights are protected, answering questions, intervening if voting rights are threatened, or even just if there's confusion at the polling places about election law and procedures. And it gives the voters a lot of confidence and a sense of security to know that when they go into the polling place, that there's going to be a lawyer there, someone who's trained in South Dakota in federal election law, who's, you know, not with the Democrats, not with the Republicans, not with any campaign, but who's just there to make sure that their right to vote is protected. So that's work that I've been very proud of. And, you know, we've had a lot of great support from a number of law firms and from some law schools who you know, who've consistently sent out and sponsored volunteers to come out to South Dakota every 2 years. And, you know, a lot of our volunteers come back again and again because they're, you know, they're really, they come out and they see how important the work is and how necessary the work is. So that's probably a long answer to a short question, but hopefully, hopefully I got there eventually.
Okay. Does anyone have any specific questions for Greg? Jennifer?
Hi, thank you. My name's Jennifer, and I wanted to ask you in a little bit more detail on top of what you already explained about what legal procedure was used to enfranchise Native American and Indigenous voters. Sorry, I've been eating cabbage. Was it observation or was it filing claims?
You know, we've done both. You know, and you know, a lot of the work that we do, you know, that OJ and I do, sometimes with partners, like the ACLU or other legal groups, is when there are discriminatory laws passed or procedures put in place, either at the state level or at the county or local level. We file lawsuits or file regulatory complaints, as the case might be, in advance of the election to try to get those overturned. And, you know, so a lot of the work that we do happens, you know, well before Election Day. And a good example of that happened now going back to 2010, which I think is, you know, when I first got to know Stephanie Woodard, is in South Dakota. What they tried to do is they started making it, you know, the early voting was becoming very popular, you know, not just in South Dakota, but, you know, as most people know, it's now very popular everywhere. That, you know, but particularly for folks that had a hard time gaining access to transportation and getting to polling places on Election Day, the ability to vote early was a great opportunity, and Native voters were taking advantage of it a lot. And in order to try to prevent that, a number of counties in South Dakota, particularly the largest reservation counties, that still were controlled sometimes by neighboring counties in terms of the clerk's offices and who would count the votes, they just stopped making early voting available to reservations. And then when the tribes protested and threatened lawsuits over it, they actually started closing polling places and said, we're not going to, you know, we're going to have fewer polling places open on Election Day. So that was a situation where there was a multi-pronged campaign of PR, of lawsuits, of complaints to the federal government, to the Department of Justice. So, a lot of that happens, like I said, that can happen anytime during the year, but it tends to ramp up over the summer and into the fall. And then, a lot of our work is also, once we get the voters registered, the important thing is then to get out the vote and then make sure their votes count. So OJ, Barb, and his team are among the best at getting out the vote, particularly on reservations. And then my job is, once Barb and OJ and their team get them to the polls, the job for the team that I lead is to make sure that folks get to vote and those votes count. So that's really where I come in on election day. Is the poll watching, monitoring the election workers, and making sure that obviously we want to prevent the kind of intimidation and discrimination at the polls, but we also want to prevent sort of technicalities and other process errors that can sometimes keep people from voting or prevent their votes from counting. We've had a lot of instances in South Dakota, fewer in recent years, but where a lot of times, Native voters were forced to vote by provisional ballot much more than in non-reservation counties. And it was very hard to then get those provisional ballots to count after the election. And they weren't counted on election night, and they often were never counted. So again, probably a long answer to a short question, but we sort of do both. We sort of fight it in the courts and in the media and with the government. But then on the day of the election, as OJ and their team are getting voters to the polls en masse, my team of lawyers and law students is making sure that they actually get to cast the ballot and those ballots count.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sally, did you have a question? I see your hand raised.
Yeah, my question is, in the last year, there's been a surge of voter suppression laws across the country. How has it affected your work?
Well, I sort of to be determined. One thing that we've noticed is, and something I alluded to earlier with OJ, is as long as we're able to anticipate it and sort of know the rules in advance and figure out our strategy for overcoming whatever the latest mode of suppression is, we're usually successful in finding a way around it. And oftentimes when we do, the fact that the votes were trying to be suppressed ends up being a major motivator to Native voters, is something that we found. We actually have a much easier time on the GOTV side convincing people to vote when they feel like there's people trying to prevent them from voting. It's a good way to overcome voter apathy. It's also a great way for us to persuade voters that their vote really counts and that they should vote. And it's a great way to exercise sovereignty and to sort of, fight back against a lot of the oppression that they're feeling, is to vote. So, I don't necessarily, we wish the suppression wasn't there, and we wish the efforts to decrease, minority populations' electoral participation, would stop. But at least in the instances that we've encountered so far, where Four Directions and our partners have worked, a lot of it has actually backfired. Because we've actually ended up breaking records and seeing seeing voter turnout go up in, where we've had enough time to strategize and come up with a plan to defeat it.
Yeah, one thing I could add to that, when the county that organizes voting in for the western half of the Pine Ridge Reservation stationed a sheriff in the door of the polling place to scare people away. That sheriff, when I interviewed him, he was doing what he was told. His bosses told him to stand in the doorway, so he did it. And the intention was to scare Native voters away. And at first it did, but then it didn't. And he was up for election that year, and he was defeated by 85% of the vote. I mean, the Lakota voters just came back and just voted him right out and voted in a tribal member. So Greg is absolutely right that those sorts of suppression can, those stunts that the counties try to pull constantly to stop people from voting can really backfire on them. And I was just remembering as you were talking, the idea of people being enthused by the fact that someone is trying to suppress them, and they're just not going to let them succeed at it. At that same polling place, a group of newly minted voters, 18-year-olds, pulled up in a GOTV car. And when I introduced myself to them as a reporter, and they were so excited to tell me who they were voting for, what ballot provisions they were supporting, and so on and so forth. I mean, it was voting at the age of 18. I mean, they were for various things that had to do with various support for the environment in different ways, for increasing the minimum wage, for various other things. And they really felt like they, at 18, could be doing something for the world around them, for their community, for the environment, and so on, by voting. And they were just all so excited. So it was very wonderful to see kids that young being so enthusiastic about voting as a way to change the world. And as a matter of fact, that was 2014, and everything they were supporting did win. So that was a nice thing for them, I'm sure, to see that they're changing the name of the county to Oglala Lakota County, and so on and so forth. All those things won. So I'm sure that was a real plus for them. They had
and Stephanie, your friend and mine, I say sarcastically, the state's attorney for Fall River County is no longer in office. You'll be glad to know.
Really? What happened to him?
He
Gossip, please.
He resigned in 2019. Amid some allegations. Let's just say, if you Google it, you'll.
Oh, I absolutely will as soon as we hang up.
This is the very fine gentleman who, Stephanie,
I
don't think I'm being over dramatic to say that this is the gentleman who physically accosted you in a parking lot on election night in 2010.
Yeah.
Because he didn't like the fact that Stephanie had reported on the fact that when the tribe protested to the state and federal government, the fact that he and others were refusing to allow the largest Native American county in the state to vote the same number of days to vote early as the other 65 or 64 of the 65 counties in the state. He retaliated by saying, well, then we're just not going to do an election in your county at all. You guys can basically run your own election. This is, a few weeks before the election, set up, find your own polling places, figure out a way to count your own votes. Yeah. And he was the state election official for that county, but he basically said, I'm not going to do it. And Stephanie reported on that story, and he ended up being shamed into, because of the attention that, the negative attention that brought to the state and to his county. He ended up being shamed into having to resume his duties and actually follow the law. But he was very angry at Stephanie for having reported the truth.
No, that's what we do. It's our job. So yeah. Well, you know what I wanted to do at this point was I wanted to go to Jeff Sally show an excerpt of a congressional hearing with Georgia Senator John Ossoff and Isleta Pueblo attorney Jacqueline De Léon of the Native American Rights Fund. And Eileen and I were talking the other night, and I think that what you can see in this video is when Native people or any group gets together and votes for a candidate, puts office holders in office who know that they're there because of a particular group or because of a collection of groups, then those people make an effort to learn about those communities, to know their issues, to know where they are. And I think that you can see how Ossoff is very aware of Native voters in Georgia, where they are, who they are, and what their issues are. In particular, in this hearing, it had to do with voting rights. But in any case, I think it's a nice lesson for the importance of voting and what it gets you in the end, which is a responsive office holder. So Sally, if you can show us the John Ossoff.
Ms. De Léon, although there are no currently federally recognized tribes in Georgia, we do have more than 100,000 voting age Native Americans in the state of Georgia, including thousands of members of the Lower Muskegee Creek tribe based in Wiggum, the Georgia tribe of Eastern Cherokee based in Dahlonega, the Cherokee Indians of Georgia based in St. George, and others. And tribal leaders in Georgia, including Chief McCormick of the Lower Muskogee, have described to me an atmosphere of discrimination and significant structural barriers that tribal members face when trying to register to vote or to cast a ballot. The Supreme Court recently made it harder for voters to challenge discriminatory voting laws and practices under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, including those that may target Native American voters. Can you please explain or share your perspective on the impact of Supreme Court's decision in Brnovich, how it might jeopardize Native voting access, including and especially for relatively smaller tribes?
Thank you so much for that thoughtful question. We were really disturbed by the Brnovich decision, and it will have a tremendous impact in Indian country. And I think Georgia actually offers a good example of how that would work in practice. So you mentioned that there were over 100,000 Native Americans in Georgia, but that there were small isolated communities. The assumption, and I think is right, is that the majority of your Native American residents live in urban centers and may not have these type of structural problems, but that there are isolated pockets of communities that could be targeted. And in Brnovich, what the court said is if the size of the affected population was small relative to the total size of the minority population, then that's okay. Essentially saying that there is a de minimis exception, which is to say that there's, if it's so small, then it doesn't count. Discrimination is discrimination, and effectively this law would now allow, entire tribes, thousands of people, to be discriminated against with impunity. And so we desperately need a Section 2 legislative fix.
Thank you, Ms. De Léon. And how, in your view, would the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act in its latest draft form restore and strengthen Section 2? And what would be the impact on ballot access for Native Americans?
That's Section 2 has, or excuse me, the VRAA has a legislative fix currently that says that de minimis exceptions are not allowed. And so that would get rid of the court's reasoning in that regard.
Could you share a little bit with the committee, please, Ms. De Léon, on the history of Jim Crow era discrimination as it affected Native Americans? My colleagues and I may be more familiar with the particulars of the structures of discrimination that targeted Black Americans, but States with substantial Native American populations sometimes made Native voters disavow and prove they were no longer culturally Native American, or imposed literacy tests impossible for Native voters to pass given a lack of proficiency in English. Can you comment on that history and its lingering impact, please?
Thank you. So I think that it's important to note that that history is not very long ago. We held those series of field hearings that I mentioned, and we heard from elderly witnesses and people who had heard from people, their grandmothers that endured that abuse. And what the story is don't vote in that system. It makes you not Indian. Don't vote in that system. You're not allowed. And that message is a direct result of state policies that were intended to disenfranchise Native Americans. And it was a lie that was perpetrated in order to rob Native Americans of their political power. And it still resonates today. And I think that it's really important that we take federal action to correct that error and to protect Native Americans from ongoing state abuses.
Thank you, ma'am. And my time is expiring, but I'll just say I think the United States government has a profound moral and historical obligation to ensure ballot access for tribes. And there may be some differences of opinion on the particulars of this legislation. I hope we can come together, Democrats and Republicans, to pass a bill that will resolve these issues that persist and make it more difficult for Native Americans to participate in our democracy after what these tribes have endured for centuries at the hands of the federal government. We have an obligation to make that extra effort to ensure that their voices are fully heard and represented in our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. If anybody has any additional questions, please raise your hand, either wave your arms or electronically raise your hand. If not, then I'll say, is anyone raising their hand? No? Okay. Then thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, Greg. And
Before you go, when was that hearing?
it was very recently. Gosh, it must have been about a month ago, something like that.
Okay. Yeah, I could tell it was very recent. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to say, Stephanie, that Ossoff made a very good point when he said that the United States has a moral and a historical obligation to make sure that Native Americans can participate in the democracy. And I think that's a big part of what we're learning here tonight, that they have not been allowed to do that. And yes, go ahead.
I was just going to mention that it occurred to me that we needed to turn back the telescope and look at this from a really wide view. Native Americans became citizens in 1924 and technically got the right to vote as citizens. And what happened, though, was the states piled on in terms of adding the kinds of requirements that Attorney De Léon just mentioned, where there were all sorts of amazing requirements. They had to prove they were no longer connected to their tribe anymore. They had to, in some cases, prove that they wore white clothing and had white furniture in their houses. There were all sorts of outlandish things that had to be done. And I think still felt nowadays, as she points out, because I often hear people say things like, even young people say, basically don't vote, it makes you not an Indian, or don't vote, that's white man's thing, that sort of comment. And I think that those attitudes and those comments are come from those things that were originally inflicted on people, which is, to prove you're not an Indian and then we'll let you vote. So anyway, yeah. Oh, Jennifer, you wanted to say something? Yeah. Oh, we can unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. I had a
there
question. It was a factual one, and it might be pretty simple to answer, but I had a question about why the date is 1924, because I thought that it would have been the 14th Amendment in 1868 that made anyone who was born or naturalized in the United States a U.S. citizen.
No, Native, the tribes were originally considered nations, other nations elsewhere, and they became part of the United States in 1924. So, Greg, do you know anything more about what led up to 24? Wait,
Sorry, the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 was really to clarify, federally, because in some states, Indians were, or Native Americans were considered citizens of the state, and in other states they were not. They were considered basically citizens of a foreign nation. They were considered tribal citizens. So the 1924 legislation basically determined that that Native Americans, regardless of where they lived or their tribal status, were also citizens of the states in which they lived and the United States. So it wasn't so much that they were universally not regarded as such, it's that there was inconsistency before that in terms of how Native Americans living on reservations who were tribal members were treated. But as Stephanie said, even after 1924, even into the 70s and 80s in places like South Dakota, there were restrictions put in place that that prevented Native Americans from voting or at least running for office.
Okay. Yeah, and there were, in addition to those out and out restrictions, there were all sorts of things that were done to make it hard for Native Americans to vote. So often precincts were set up for them that required a 100-mile, even a 200-mile round trip drive to register or to vote. It would be like any of us being told you can't vote unless you go to Albany to do it. I mean, it really is comparable to that. And I remember talking to a county official about this, and she said, well, they just have to try harder. They're just not trying. And so there were all sorts of petty things like that, like setting up precincts really far away, like stationing a sheriff in the doorway of the office, like suddenly at the last minute canceling registration for that day, when people were counting on it, et cetera. So all sorts of things go on to try
right.
to Native people.
And sorry, Stephanie, without getting sort of too much into the legal background in the history, but there were a number of different federal court decisions and state court decisions that created confusion between the time the 14th Amendment was passed and 1924 about the circumstances, under which sometimes tribal citizens were U.S. citizens and sometimes they weren't. And there were issues of criminal jurisdiction. There were issues of jurisdiction for taxation. So a lot of this didn't have to do with voting. It had to deal with who could own property, who had jurisdiction for criminal purposes, who could tax, and a lot of it came down to, are these foreign citizens, so therefore not subject to the 14th Amendment, even though they were born within the boundaries of the United States, or are they subject to the 14th Amendment? And the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 basically clarified once and for all that under both federal law and therefore under the law of all 50 states, Indians were citizens. So really what it said is the 14th Amendment meant that all along, but it took nearly 60 years to sort that out.
All right, thank you both. Thank you.
Yep.
Well, Stephanie, I want to thank you, Greg and OJ, for this wonderful message, wonderful, powerful, enlightening message that you've brought to us tonight. We hope you'll come back, and we're just so happy that you're here to share it with us. Thank you so much. Thank you
very much.
Okay, folks, moving along. We're now going to hear from Mari Inoue. I hope I'm saying her name correctly. of the Manhattan Project for a Nuclear-Free World about the Roses to Mission Project, honoring the first anniversary of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Welcome, Mari.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here. My name is Mari Inoue. I'm one of the co-founding members of Manhattan Project for Nuclear Free World, which is a volunteer-led grassroots group started in 2012 to raise awareness on the costs, risks, and humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy. And I have three upcoming events that I'd like to announce to you. One is Roses to Missions Action. Second one is on the 21st in New York City, join the Nuclear Ban Treaty rally and march. And the third one is educational seminar online, which is called Nuclear Colonialism in the Age of the Ban Treaty, organized by Affected Communities Working Group. So I'd like to start with the Roses to Missions Action. Is it okay that I share screen?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. All right. Okay, so Roses to Missions is about thanking those member states of the United Nations that ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This treaty was adopted by the United Nations in July 2017, but in order for this treaty to be enforceable, it has to be signed and ratified by at least 50 member states. And that happened in October 2021. And 90 days after that, it became, it entered into force on January 22nd, 2021. Oh, I'm sorry. So 50 member states ratified in October 2020 and entered into force on January 22nd, 2021. And Sally of Peace Action reached out to me, and she talked about her idea to deliver yellow roses to UN missions of those 50 member states to thank them, because none of the nuclear weapon states ratified the treaty. None of the NATO states or their allies ratified the treaty. But many member states from Global South predominantly ratified this treaty. And because of that, on January 22nd last year, finally the nuclear weapons became illegal under international law, which was more than 70 years after the first use of nuclear weapons. So we delivered 51 roses and thank you certificates last year. We divided into 8 teams, and it took about a week to deliver to 51 member states, but that's what we did. But the media didn't, report about this. Only Japanese media showed up at the rally in front of the UN on January 22nd, unfortunately, except this one in the middle. This one was a newspaper, local newspaper, distributed in the Black community in Westchester. And they put out press release, the entire press release on behalf of our group. And that was the only US media that reported about this important historical moment. Let me put this see. Oh, thank you. So this year, we are also going to send yellow roses and thank you certificates to 8 additional member states that ratified the treaty after January 22nd of last year. And we also plan to have this rally in March on 21st at noon in front of the New York Public Library to send a message to the US mission to the UN to join the treaty. So let me show this, this one as well. Let me see this one. Yep. So the rally will start from noon on 21st Friday in front of the New York Public Library. We will have some songs and speakers. That's 5th Avenue and 41st Street. So please join us. And the last one that I'd like to share with you is about this seminar. I'm going to put the link to you, link in the chat. So this is an event organized by the Affected Communities Working Group of the Nuclear Ban Treaty Collaborative. We have members of those impacted communities affected by the nuclear weapon development, use, and testing in the United States. And we have speakers who is a member of the Indigenous community. She is, I believe, that from Cherokee Nation. And also we have speakers who is 3rd generation Hiroshima survivor, as well as a daughter. We also have a daughter of Japanese fishermen who was affected by the nuclear testing in the Pacific. We also have activists and educator in New Mexico, which is a state heavily impacted by the uranium mining and nuclear testing. And also now New Mexico is considered as a state to dump radioactive waste from nuclear facilities, and they're opposed to that. We also have activists and artists from Marshallese communities that was also heavily impacted by the nuclear testing by the United States. And because of the climate change and also the radioactive contamination in their islands, many of them have to move to United States and not able to go back to their hometown. So we have amazing speakers from those affected communities and their allies. So please join us. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mari. Really, it's for keeping us informed and for bringing us up to date. Is there any way that we can get this information to Peace Action, Sally? That I think it's come out already, Sally, right? And Steve Bliss, and yes. So we thank you for your work. You and Sally both. It was wonderful. I had a chance last year to go to a couple of the missions, and it was very exciting, and it was wonderful to meet the people, and made you feel that this is such important work, made you understand the importance of the work. So thank you very much.
Yes.
Okay.